And now I'd like to welcome State Senator from Nebraska, Tom Brewer, here in the studio. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today on TV.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, we had you when you were joining us from Kyiv before you started your trip along the front lines. So I'm very, very interested, and I think our viewers are too, in what exactly you experienced going along the front lines. Take us on your trip.
Well, I understand it's my fourth trip over. So first trip was in May of 2022. The war had been going for just a few months. They were kind of trying to get some type of stable situation. I came back in the fall, just when the Kyiv offensive had happened, and there was a lot more excitement. And then, of course, last year we were there for the start of the counteroffensive. And then this year, it was quite a little difference in that it was an army in a country, I think, that's kind of wore down. The war has taken a toll. It doesn't change their desire to stay free and continue the fight. It's just you can see that they're struggling sometimes where before it was a lot more positive outlook. And I think it was a combination of the glide bombs that they really can't counter, and then the constant pressure. Of course, we were there. We went forward to Kyiv as everything was happening there. And so, you could feel their pain and you can understand their needs, but, unfortunately, I'm not really in a position to change a lot of, but I did take a lot of notes to take back and share with friends in Congress about what they need in order to be successful.
And how do you find the morale there? Because there are lots of reports going around, and you see these people who need to be evacuated. They're being forced to evacuate for obvious reasons, but they just desperately want to stay in their homes, especially the older generation, and it's just absolutely heartbreaking to watch.
It is. When we were outside of Kyiv, they were bringing in, the villages were going to be taken. It was a foregone conclusion. And it was impressive that through all of that, they made sure and brought their dogs and their cat with them, and photo albums. But they had accepted the fact that they had to go. Now there are some that were left behind, and most of those are of what I'd say the old generation that understood the Soviet days, and they somehow just cannot find it in their hearts that the army that was the Soviet army, now the Russian army, would be so brutal as to come in and do the things that are happening. And so they have no car, they have no money. So for them, there are just very few options, but they're doing a good job of bringing them in and providing resources for them and finding housing and clothing. And so for the Ukrainian government, I was impressed, and the international aid foundations that were there, they did a good job of handling it, but it's almost overwhelming in Kyiv. It's the second largest town, or at least it was before the war,
right.
And they're just being brutalized every day, and I can't help but feel bad for them, and that's the word I'm going to take back is we have the ability to help them with the resources we have, either bringing Patriot batteries farther forward or expediting the fielding of the F-16, but we have to find a way to keep them from doing that, or they literally are pounded over and over again. And then I think we have to face the fact that if we can find them massing across the border, knowing they're going to attack, and yet we can't use the weapon systems that we're giving them, that's a terrible handcuffing of them in a time. And we've seen what happened in other places, like Vietnam, when we had borders that couldn't be crossed in order to prevent an attack. So I think those have to be considered, or else I think you're going to see a much higher casualty rate on the part of the Ukrainians.
Right, especially there along the border area. I mean, it's literally asking them. I remember the comparison was made that it's like playing a game of tennis with one hand behind your back, but actually now it's almost like two hands behind your back.
It almost is. And sadly, we have the weapon systems. We just won't allow them to be used. The new ATACMS, which has an extended range that goes out to 300 kilometers. If you make a sweep and you look at what all is available for them to hit in the way of targets, a lot of the command and control, a lot of the ammunition dumps, a lot of the railheads, things that are bringing stuff to the Ukraine to fight could be stopped long before it got there.
Certainly. I want to follow up and ask about the weapon systems. I've seen reports lately that said basically the The HIMARS that they have right now are largely ineffective because they're being jammed. The ground-based glide bombs that they've also been supplied are getting jammed by Russian electronic warfare. And the smart artillery that's GPS guided is also ineffective at this time.
Yes, the Excalibur, which is part of that 155 precision munition that we have, is affected, along with the other things you mentioned there, and it's the barrage jamming. The Soviets were very good at this, and they had planned to fight the war in what is now, the area of Poland and East Germany and West Germany, using this barrage jamming, and they're very, very good at it. They figured out how to tweak it so that it did do what they wanted it to do, and we need experts on the ground helping them do that, and that's a reason why I personally think that we should have U.S. observers and other NATOs too that are true experts in these areas to help the Ukrainians, because we have the expertise. We just don't have the ability to bring them to where they need to be to take that expertise and turn it into a way to help those munitions do what we need them to do. So we're basically wasting our assets because we won't share what we know will help them win the war.
But this is a political decision, is it not? These are the politicians that are putting the constraints.
It is, and it's frustrating because you have a situation where there's the resources and the passion to win the war, but we're limiting it and allowing just enough to continue the war, but not win the war. And all that correlates to is more lost lives on the part of the Ukrainians. And, they cannot afford to continue the losses they're having because, unlike Russia, they don't have a limitless supply of personnel. Plus, they very smartly use their people because they value them so much more. But I don't know that we're doing a very fair job of helping them in the ways that they need right now to win the war.
Well, speaking of personnel and just, holding on but not winning the war, what were the impressions that you had in regards to the conscription legislation? Because there's still the lack of personnel, and when you speak to U.S. military officials, there's always that criticism that age needs to be lowered even further. There aren't enough people to fight this war.
No, that's a brilliant point, and it's been brought up a number of times to me, and they said, listen, if they need personnel, do like the Americans in some of the NATO countries and have that conscription at age 18. I think they made a conscious decision that they wanted a generation to be able to go to college, to be educated, to be trained, and so they tried to
have
avoid
children as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, because that is an area that they have to think down the road. Mm-hmm. But also, if they don't win the war, none of that will matter. So I think you'll see it. It's down to 25 now. I would think it will come lower. Their decision to bring prisoners and give them an opportunity, I think if it's done correctly, otherwise they look at them and make sure they're taking the right ones that just want a chance at amnesty and aren't ones that would cause issues later, then you could build around that. Mm-hmm. And I think they have to think out of the box. That's what they're doing right now. But I would be surprised if that age doesn't come down to like a 23, something like that, because ultimately you have to have people to run the equipment that we're giving them, or they won't be successful.
Yeah.
Right. Now, you also spent time with soldiers. You've been there a few times before. This is your fourth time, I think you said. So have you noticed a difference in morale amongst the soldiers? Are they seem a little bit more worn down than previous trips?
Maybe a little more worn down. They like the new equipment. They have a instilled fear of drones, partly because they understand the potential of the drones from the ones they're using, which I think Ukrainians are kind of like those guys that can MacGyver together things that you wouldn't think would necessarily be as successful as they are. Their idea of hooking a grenade to a drone and flying it over and then hooking a whole bunch of grenades, and they just keep expanding that. The Russians have the Lancet and others that are very effective, but the back and forth drone war leaves you in a position when you're up on the front where you're looking over your shoulder. If you hear a drone, it runs a cold chill down your spine because it's brutal when they hit. And so the drones have changed the war to where it used to be armor and artillery war. And now it is a drone war for the most part, except where there's, you know, a breakthrough, and then you still have the violence of a tank battle or armored personnel carriers.
Certainly. How do you think this is going to affect the United States and, you know, how the United States invests in its military? What impact is what we're seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine going to translate over to the United States, do you think?
Well, I know I'm going to explain to the generals when I get back that if we only focus on the army that we built in the 90s and into the 2000s, we're fools. Because you can take a $10 million tank and destroy it with a properly set up drone, and that's a pretty good trade for a few $1,000s for $10 million. You can't do that. We thought of armies as huge armies that would run linear battles, and I'm not so sure what we're seeing in Ukraine won't be the future of warfare. So we have to come up with a much smarter way of fighting wars, and we also have to understand that what we do will not work over there. They live in bunkers almost continuously. They survive because they move at night. They think in a way that they have to survive. The American Army is used to living in tents and having a pretty good life. And everything we do has to change, or this modern battlefield will eat up a lot of the armies of old.
Right. Definitely need to adapt for sure. Well, I think with that, sir, Mr. State Senator from Nebraska, Tom Brewer, thank you very much for sharing your insight in these matters. It's very valuable for us.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.